Parents refused to help with my college. Now they expect me to loan them money. All right, here goes nothing. So my name's Kevin, I'm 32, and I work as a mechanic. It's not a fancy job, but it pays the bills, and I actually enjoy it. You get to see stuff getting fixed, and I like the feeling of solving a problem. Plus, owning my own little garage now means I don't have to answer to some clueless manager. Anyway, that's not the point here. The point is, my family is kind of a mess, and my sister Amy is a huge part of that. Let me give you a bit of background. Growing up, my family wasn't poor, but we weren't well off either. My mom, Janice, worked at a local diner, and my dad, Rick, is a truck driver. Nothing glamorous. They worked hard, but there was never a ton of extra cash lying around. My parents were practical, which is why what happened with Amy still blows my mind. So Amy is my younger sister by about 3 years. She's always been the golden child. You know, the type who got everything handed to her on a silver platter while I was expected to figure things out on my own, and she never worked for anything in her life. Growing up, it was like she could do no wrong. If she wanted something, my parents would bend over backward to make it happen. But if I wanted anything, I had to work for it or forget about it. I'm not going to lie, I've always been a bit resentful about that. I mean, how could I not be? There I was, busting my ass mowing lawns, working odd jobs, and doing whatever I could to save up for things, while Amy was getting handed money to go shopping with her friends or whatever. My parents acted like it was no big deal, but trust me, it got under my skin. Anyway, fast forward a bit to when I was about 27. I'd finally saved up enough to buy my first house. Nothing fancy, just a little two-bedroom fixer-upper on the edge of town. It wasn't in the best neighborhood, but it was mine, you know? I spent months fixing it up. Paint, new floors, redoing the kitchen, the whole thing. I was proud of it. I mean, it was the first time in my life I really felt like I'd accomplished something big on my own. So naturally, I decided to host Thanksgiving that year. I figured it'd be a good way to show off my hard work to my family. So I invited my parents, and even though I knew it'd be a pain, I invited Amy too. She'd been dating this real estate guy, John, for about a year at that point. This guy was loaded, or at least that's what Amy kept bragging about. Fancy car, nice clothes, living in some luxury condo downtown. Whatever. I didn't care about his money. Good for him, I guess. But what I didn't expect was how Amy and John were going to act at Thanksgiving. The day comes, and I've been cooking all day, cleaning the house, making sure everything's perfect. My parents show up, and everything's going smoothly. We're talking, catching up, eating appetizers, you know, normal stuff. Then Amy and John roll up. Now, right off the bat, Amy comes in with this attitude like she's better than everyone else. She walks around the house looking at everything like she's inspecting it. I tried to let it go, but I could feel my blood starting to boil. She starts making these little comments about how small the house is, how old-fashioned the decor looks, and how the neighborhood isn't exactly safe. She doesn't stop there, though. She goes on and on about how John's condo is huge, with floor-to-ceiling windows, a view of the city, and some fancy security system. I kept my mouth shut, but I was seething inside. Like, seriously? Who comes to someone's house for Thanksgiving and spends the whole time criticizing it? My parents didn't say anything, of course. They just sat there, probably thinking, oh, that's just Amy. I could feel my patience slipping away, but I was trying to be the bigger person, you know? I didn't want to cause a scene. But then she crossed the line. She starts talking about how John pays for everything, how lucky she is to be with him, and how she'd never have to live in a place like mine. Like, really rubbing it in my face. That's when I lost it. I looked at her and said, at least I bought this house with my own money. I worked for it. I didn't need our parents to pay for anything. And I definitely didn't need to rely on someone else's paycheck to get it. Can you say the same? Amy's face went red, and I could tell I'd hit a nerve. John, who had been pretty quiet up until that point, gave me this annoyed look. But he didn't say anything. My parents just sat there, awkward as hell, like they had no idea what to do. I didn't care anymore. I was pissed. Then I told her, if you think you're too good for my place, you can show yourself the door. No one's keeping you here. And that was it. She and John stormed out without saying another word. My parents tried to calm me down afterward, saying things like, she didn't mean it, and you know how she is. But I wasn't having it. I'd had enough. I told them I wasn't going to keep putting up with her crap just because she's family. From that moment on, Amy and I stopped talking. I haven't seen her since that day, and honestly, I'm fine with it. My life's been a lot less stressful without her in it. My parents, though, they've never stopped trying to get us to make up. Every once in a while, they'll bring her up saying stuff like, family's family, or you two should let bygones be bygones. But I'm not interested. Amy's always been a spoiled, entitled brat, and nothing's changed. So yeah, that's how it all went down. My sister hasn't spoken to me in 5 years because I finally stood up to her. And honestly, I don't miss her. She was always a source of stress, and my life's better without her drama. All right, so here we are, 5 years after that whole Thanksgiving disaster. Things have been pretty quiet between Amy and me. Honestly, I thought it'd just stay that way, and I was totally fine with it. No drama, no stress. But of course, nothing ever stays simple for long when family's involved. A couple of weeks ago, my mom calls me up out of the blue. I hadn't heard from her in a little while, which wasn't unusual. We'd been on decent terms since the whole Amy thing went down, but we didn't talk every day or anything. Anyway, she calls, and the first thing she says is, "Kevin, we need to talk." Now, when someone says that, it's never good, right? My mind starts racing, thinking maybe something bad happened with Dad's health or something. But nope, it's not that. Instead, she drops this bombshell on me. Amy's getting married to that same guy, John, from 5 years ago, the guy who was with her during that Thanksgiving nightmare. I'll be honest, my first reaction wasn't great. I just kind of sighed and said, "Oh, okay," because, well, what else was I supposed to say? It's not like I care about Amy's relationship status anymore, but I figured that's where the conversation would end. Nope. Mom starts going on about how Amy's wedding is this huge deal and how it's going to be really fancy. She's talking about venues, flowers, the whole 9 yards. And of course, she's excited. My parents have always been way more invested in Amy's life than mine. It's just the way things have always been. But then, she says something that makes me pause. "We've promised Amy that we'll cover the cost of the venue and decorations," Mom says. "But Kevin, we're going to need a little help." I had to do a double take at that. "Wait, what? You need help with what?" I ask, feeling a little confused. "We need you to help us cover the costs," she says, as if this is just a normal thing to ask. I'm not going to lie. I was floored. I didn't even know what to say at first. My parents wanted me to give them money for Amy's wedding, the same Amy I haven't spoken to in 5 years, the same Amy who made my life miserable for most of our childhood, the same Amy who walked out of my house without so much as an apology that Thanksgiving. It felt like I was living in some alternate reality where none of that mattered. I mean, come on. They seriously expected me to help pay for her wedding? I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Mom, why would you even think I'd want to do that?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, even though I was already starting to get worked up. Mom seemed genuinely surprised. "Kevin, it's your sister. Family helps family." That's when I snapped. I told her exactly what I thought. Family helps family? Really? Where was that energy when I needed help paying for trade school? You guys didn't lift a finger back then? But now you want me to hand over money for Amy's wedding? The same Amy I don't even speak to? Mom got real quiet after that, probably because she didn't have a good answer. I didn't stop there, though. I reminded her about all the times Amy got whatever she wanted while I had to fend for myself, how they let her walk all over me for years, and now they're asking me for money like none of that ever happened. After a minute, Mom finally said, "It's different, Kevin. We didn't have the money back then." I just laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how ridiculous it sounded. "And you think I have money to just throw at Amy's wedding now? Do you even hear yourself? I'm not giving you a single dime for this. If you can't afford it, you shouldn't have promised it." Mom got defensive after that, saying they didn't want Amy to feel like they couldn't support her, especially in front of John's wealthy family. Apparently, they've been trying to keep up with his parents, who are loaded and throwing money at the wedding left and right. My parents wanted to contribute so they didn't look like they were falling behind. It was all just so shallow. I mean, who cares if John's family has more money? It doesn't change the fact that Amy's spoiled and entitled. But my parents were so wrapped up in this image they wanted to present that they were willing to beg me for money just to keep up appearances. I told Mom I wasn't going to help, that it wasn't my responsibility, and I didn't even care about the wedding. She tried to guilt trip me, saying how this was a once-in-a-lifetime event, and how it would mean a lot to the family if I pitched in. But I wasn't budging. I told her straight up that she needed to figure this out without me. She sounded disappointed, but I wasn't backing down. We ended the call on a pretty awkward note, with her telling me she'd talk to Dad and figure out another way. The whole thing just left me feeling drained. I couldn't believe the nerve they had to even ask me for money after all these years, especially for Amy, of all people. It just brought back all the resentment I thought I'd buried after that Thanksgiving fight. The way my parents have always bent over backward for Amy, while I've had to figure everything out on my own. It's like nothing's changed. Over the next few days, I tried to forget about it, but it kept eating at me. Part of me wondered if I'd overreacted. I mean, it was my parents asking for help, and I've always been the kind of person who tries to do right by them, even when they frustrate me. But this felt different. It felt like they were crossing a line. I was still stewing over the whole thing when my dad called me a week later. Now my dad doesn't usually call unless it's something important, so I picked up right away. He cut straight to the point. Your mom told me you won't help with Amy's wedding, he said. No hello, no small talk, just straight into it. Yeah, that's right, I said, feeling my stomach tighten. I could already tell this conversation wasn't going to go well. Dad let out a long sigh. Kevin, we really need you to help us out here. We've already committed to paying for part of it, and now we're stuck. If we don't come through, it's going to look bad. There it was again, this obsession with how things looked. It wasn't even about Amy anymore. It was about saving face in front of John's family. I could feel the anger bubbling up again. Look, Dad, I said, trying to stay calm. I'm not responsible for the promises you made. If you can't afford it, then you shouldn't have offered to pay. I'm not going to bail you out. Dad didn't like that. He started going on about how families should stick together and how they've always done their best for us. But the more he talked, the more I realized something. They weren't asking for my help because they needed it. They were asking because they expected it, like it was my duty to clean up their mess. So I cut him off. I'm sorry, Dad, but I'm not doing it. You'll have to figure something else out. And that was it. The conversation ended on a sour note, just like the one with my mom. They weren't happy with me, but for once I didn't feel guilty. I'd spent my whole life trying to keep the peace, but this time I wasn't going to let them push me around. All right, so after that conversation with my dad, I thought things would settle down. I'd made my stance pretty clear, and I figured they'd just leave it alone. I mean, what else could they do, right? But of course, that's not how my family works. It never is. A few days later, I get this message from my cousin Mark. Now, Mark's one of the few relatives I actually get along with. He's not into the whole drama thing, and we've always been on good terms. So when he texts me saying, "Hey, can we talk?" I figured it was something casual, maybe just catching up or whatever. But when we got on the phone, it was pretty clear that wasn't the case. "Kev, man, what's going on with your folks?" he asked, not even bothering with the usual small talk. "What do you mean?" I replied, already feeling a knot form in my stomach. I had a feeling I knew where this was headed, but I wasn't about to jump to conclusions. Mark sighed. "I just talked to your mom, and she was like, really upset. She said something about how you refused to help with Amy's wedding, and now the whole family's talking about it." And there it was. The thing I'd been dreading. I didn't think my parents would actually start spreading this around to the rest of the family, but I guess I shouldn't have been surprised. They'd done it before, especially when they wanted to paint themselves as the victims. This was just their style. Go around telling everyone their version of the story, leaving out all the important details that might make people see things differently. I tried to stay calm as I explained the situation to Mark. Yeah, they asked me to help pay for the wedding, and I told them no. I mean, I don't even talk to Amy, so why would I shell out money for her big day? It doesn't make sense. Mark listened quietly, and when I finished, he just said, "Man, I get it, I really do. But you know how your parents are. They're making it sound like you're the one causing problems, and now the whole family's talking about it. It's getting kind of messy." That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about my parents and me anymore. They dragged the entire family into this, and now I was being painted as the bad guy. I could feel the frustration bubbling up, but I didn't want to take it out on Mark. He wasn't the one stirring the pot. He was just giving me a heads up. "Great," I muttered, rubbing my temples. "So now everyone thinks I'm some selfish jerk, huh?" Mark hesitated for a second before answering. "Well, yeah, kinda. But it's not like people know the whole story, Kev. They're only hearing what your folks are saying. And you know how they like to spin things." I laughed bitterly. "Yeah, I know exactly how they like to spin things." After I got off the phone with Mark, I was pissed. I mean, it's one thing to have a disagreement with your parents, but to have them go around telling everyone in the family, twisting the story to make you look bad, that's a whole new level of low. I wasn't about to sit back and let them trash my name without setting the record straight. So I did something I wasn't sure I'd regret or not. I sent out a group text to the family. You know, the kind of message you think twice about before hitting send, but still do it anyway because you're just that fed up. Yeah, that kind. It wasn't anything crazy, but I laid out the situation as clearly as I could. "Hey, just wanted to clear some things up since I've heard a lot of talk going around. Yes, Mom and Dad asked me to help pay for Amy's wedding. No, I'm not helping. I haven't spoken to Amy in years, and it doesn't make sense for me to pay for something I'm not involved in. I didn't start this drama, but I'm not going to be guilt-tripped into doing something I'm not comfortable with. Thanks." Short, to the point, and hopefully enough to stop people from assuming the worst about me. I didn't expect anyone to respond, honestly. I just wanted to get my side out there before the gossip got any worse. But of course, things didn't exactly go the way I planned. Within minutes, my phone started blowing up. I got a text from my aunt, a call from my grandma, and even a message from some cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. Most of them were polite enough, asking if everything was okay or offering their support, which felt more like thinly veiled nosiness. But then there were the not-so-nice ones. My Uncle Gary, who's always been way too invested in family business, sent me this long-winded text about how family comes first and how I was being petty by holding on to old grudges. He went on about how Mom and Dad were only trying to do right by Amy and how I should help out for the sake of the family. It was infuriating, but I decided not to respond. Engaging with people like Gary would only make things worse. Then my mom called. I could hear it in her voice. She was pissed. Kevin, what the hell is going on? Why are you sending messages to the whole family? Because, Mom, you've been going around telling everyone I'm refusing to help and making me look bad. I'm just clearing the air, I said, trying to keep my cool. I didn't say anything that wasn't true, she snapped back. You are refusing to help, and now everyone's upset because they don't understand why you're being so selfish. Selfish? You've got to be kidding me, Mom. I'm not paying for a wedding I'm not even involved in. That's not selfish. That's just common sense, I shot back. Mom huffed into the phone. You don't understand, Kevin. We're trying to make sure Amy has the wedding she deserves, and now everyone thinks we can't handle it. That's not my problem, Mom. You're the ones who promised her all this stuff. If you can't afford it, then you shouldn't have made those promises. Don't drag me into it. There was silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought maybe I'd finally gotten through to her. But then she hit me with this. You're turning your back on family, Kevin, and one day, you're going to regret it. I didn't even know how to respond to that. I was just tired. Tired of the guilt trips, tired of the manipulation, tired of always being the one expected to clean up everyone else's mess. So I just said, I'm sorry you feel that way, Mom, and hung up. For the rest of the night, I just sat there staring at my phone as the notifications kept rolling in. I wasn't about to engage in more back and forth with my family, but I couldn't help but feel angry about how everything had blown up, all because I didn't want to fork over money for a wedding I wasn't even a part of. By the time I went to bed, I realized something. This whole situation wasn't just about money. It wasn't about the wedding, or Amy, or even my parents, really. It was about control. My family had always expected me to fall in line, to play along, to be the good son who never rocked the boat. And this time, I didn't. And maybe that's why they were so mad. Not because I wouldn't pay for the wedding, but because I finally said no. After that whole mess with the family texts and the phone call from my mom, I thought things would die down. I had made my point, and I didn't really care if people were upset with me anymore. I wasn't about to keep fighting over something that, in my mind, was pretty simple. I wasn't paying for my sister's wedding. End of story. But, like everything with my family, it didn't just end there. A few days after the last call, I get a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I figured it was probably just a delivery or something. But when I opened the door, I was pretty shocked to see my dad standing there. Now let me tell you, my dad doesn't just show up out of the blue like that. In fact, I don't think he's ever visited my place without calling first, so right away I knew something was up. Hey Kev, he said, looking a little awkward. Can we talk? I didn't know what to say at first, but I nodded and stepped aside to let him in. I wasn't in the mood for another argument, but it didn't seem like I had much of a choice. He walked in, kind of glancing around the living room like he hadn't seen it before, even though he had. It felt tense, like neither of us knew how to start this conversation. So, what's going on? I finally asked, figuring I'd let him make the first move. Dad sighed and sat down on the couch. I just wanted to clear the air, he said. Things have gotten pretty out of hand and your mom's really upset. I sat down across from him, not really sure where this was going, but ready to defend myself if it turned into another guilt trip. Yeah, I've noticed, I said. But I don't know what you want me to do about it. I've already explained where I stand. I know, Dad said, rubbing his hands together like he was trying to find the right words. But this whole thing with Amy's wedding, it's gotten bigger than it should have been. We didn't expect you to pay for everything, Kev. We were just hoping you could help out a little, as family. There it was again. Family. That magic word they always throw out when they want me to bend. I tried to stay calm, but I could feel that frustration bubbling up again. Dad, I've already said no. I don't have anything against you or Mom, but this is Amy's wedding. Amy, who I haven't spoken to in 5 years. It doesn't make sense for me to pitch in when I'm not even involved in her life. Dad nodded, but I could tell he wasn't really getting it. I get that, Kev, I do. But your mom, she's really struggling with all this. We promised Amy we'd help, and now it's turning into a mess. We don't want to look like we're falling short, especially with John's parents paying for everything. That's when I realized what this was really about. It wasn't about helping Amy or even the wedding itself. It was about appearances. They were more worried about how they looked compared to John's family than they were about the actual situation. They didn't want to seem like they couldn't handle it. I understand that, Dad, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But that's on you guys. You promised her. I didn't. You didn't ask me before making those promises, and now you want me to bail you out because it's gotten too expensive. I'm sorry, but that's not my problem. Dad leaned back, running a hand over his face. He looked tired, like the whole situation was wearing him down. You're right. We probably bit off more than we could chew, he admitted, but we didn't want Amy to feel like we weren't supporting her. I let out a breath, trying to be patient. And I get that. I really do. But you guys have always supported Amy. You've done more for her than you ever did for me. And I'm not saying that to be bitter, but it's the truth. So now, when you come to me, expecting me to help with something I'm not even involved in, it just feels wrong. Dad was quiet for a minute, and for the first time, it seemed like he might actually be listening. I guess we didn't see it that way, he said slowly. We just thought, well, maybe if you helped, it would start to mend things between you and Amy. I almost laughed at that. Mend things between Amy and me? As if throwing money at her wedding was going to magically fix 5 years of silence and resentment. Dad, money's not going to fix that, I said. Amy and I have our issues, and they go way deeper than this wedding. You can't just slap a Band-Aid on it with a check. He sighed again, nodding like he understood, but still not really getting it. I guess you're right, he said, sounding defeated. I just don't know how to make all this better. Your mom's really upset, and it's making everything harder. That was the thing about my dad. He wasn't a bad guy, but he always tried to fix everything for everyone, even when it wasn't his responsibility. And in doing that, he'd end up dragging himself into more stress than he needed. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. Dad, I'm not trying to make things harder for you guys, but I'm not going to pay for Amy's wedding. I'm not. It's just not my responsibility, and you and Mom need to stop acting like it is. He nodded, looking down at the floor. All right, Kev, I hear you. We'll figure something out. For the first time in this whole mess, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, he was starting to accept that I wasn't going to cave, that I wasn't going to swoop in and save the day with my wallet. It felt good to finally stand my ground and have him at least acknowledge it, even if I knew my mom wasn't going to be as easy to convince. Dad stayed for a little while longer, and we talked about other stuff, work, life, anything that wasn't wedding related. It was nice to just have a normal conversation with him, something we didn't do often enough. But eventually he had to leave, and as he stood up to go, he gave me this look like he wanted to say more but didn't know how. Take care of yourself, Kev, he said, giving me a pat on the shoulder before heading out the door. You too, Dad, I replied, watching him walk down the steps. As I closed the door behind him, I felt this weird mix of relief and frustration. I was glad we'd talked, but I knew this wasn't the end of it. My mom was still fuming, Amy was still getting married, and the family drama wasn't going to disappear overnight. But at least for now, I'd said my piece. I wasn't backing down. And honestly, that felt pretty damn good. All right, so after that talk with my dad, I thought for a second that maybe things would finally settle down. He seemed to understand where I was coming from, or at least he was willing to leave it alone for a bit. But I should have known better. When it comes to my family, things are never that simple. A few days passed, and things were quiet, too quiet. No calls, no texts, nothing. At first, it was kind of a relief. I thought maybe they were finally backing off, giving me some space to breathe. But then, the silence started to feel off. You know that feeling when you just know something's brewing, but you don't know what? Yeah, that. And of course, I was right. One evening, I'm sitting at home after work, just relaxing, when my phone buzzes. It's a text from my Aunt Janet. Now, Aunt Janet is one of those relatives who's always involved in everyone's business. She's never really picked sides before, but she loves to stir the pot and act like she's the mediator in the family. So when I saw her name pop up, I already knew this wasn't going to be good. Her message said something like, "Hey Kevin, I've been hearing a lot about what's going on with the family. I think we should talk." I sighed, debating whether or not to even respond. But then I figured, what the hell, I might as well hear her out. Maybe she had some perspective I hadn't considered. Spoiler alert, she didn't. I called her, and right from the start it was clear where this conversation was headed. "Kevin, honey, I just want to understand why you're being so stubborn about this whole wedding thing," she said. her voice dripping with that fake sweetness she always uses when she's about to lay into someone. I mean, it's your sister's wedding. Don't you think you could just help out a little? For the sake of the family? There it was again. That same phrase. For the sake of the family. Like that was supposed to be the magic word that made me open my wallet and forget all the crap I'd been through. I've already explained this to Mom and Dad, I said, trying to stay calm even though I could feel my patience thinning. I don't have a relationship with Amy. We haven't spoken in 5 years, Janet. I'm not going to help pay for a wedding when I'm not even part of her life. Aunt Janet sighed like she was talking to a toddler who just couldn't understand simple logic. But Kevin, family is family. You don't have to be best friends with Amy to do something nice for her. Weddings are a big deal. It's one of those events where everyone comes together. It could be a chance for you two to reconnect. I almost laughed at that. Reconnect? After 5 years of nothing? And I was supposed to do that by throwing money at her wedding? It sounded ridiculous. I'm sorry, but that's not going to happen, I said, keeping my voice steady. Amy and I aren't going to magically fix things just because I help pay for her wedding. It doesn't work like that. And I'm not going to pretend like everything's fine between us when it's not. Janet was quiet for a moment, and I thought maybe, just maybe, she was starting to get it. But then she hit me with, "You're being really selfish, Kevin." That word, selfish. I'd heard it so many times over the last few weeks, and every time I heard it, it made my blood boil. Selfish? For not wanting to be dragged into a situation that had nothing to do with me? For standing up for myself after years of being overlooked and ignored? How am I being selfish? I asked, my voice sharper now. I've done nothing but try to keep the peace in this family for years. I've stayed quiet, I've stayed out of the drama, and now when I finally say no to something, I'm the selfish one? Aunt Janet clicked her tongue, clearly not impressed with my little rant. You're not seeing the bigger picture, Kevin. This is about more than just you and Amy. It's about the family. Your parents are heartbroken over this. They just want everyone to come together. And I'm the one who's supposed to make that happen by giving them money? I shot back. Come on, Janet, you know that's ridiculous. She sighed again, this time sounding more annoyed than sweet. Look, I'm just trying to help. I think you're making a big deal out of nothing, but if you're set on this, fine. Just know that you're making things harder for everyone. I didn't even know what to say to that. There was no winning here. No matter how many times I explained myself, it was never enough. I was always the bad guy in their eyes, the one causing problems. All right, Janet, I said, tired of the whole conversation. Thanks for the talk. Before she could respond, I hung up the phone. I didn't have the energy for it anymore. As I sat there, staring at my phone, I couldn't help but feel angry. Angry at my parents for dragging the family into this. Angry at my relatives for making me out to be the villain. And honestly, a little angry at myself for even caring about what they thought. I knew I was right to say no, but the constant pressure was starting to wear on me. The next day, I went to work like usual, trying to push the family drama out of my mind. But it was harder than I thought. Every time I checked my phone, there was another message from someone in the family, cousins, uncles, even a few people I hadn't spoken to in years, all chiming in with their opinions on the situation. By lunchtime, I'd had enough. I turned off my phone and shoved it into my toolbox, deciding to just focus on the cars in front of me and forget about the rest. At least at the garage, things made sense. You fix something, it works. Simple. None of this emotional mess that came with family. When I got home that night, I hesitated before turning my phone back on. Part of me didn't even want to deal with whatever new messages had come through. But of course, curiosity got the better of me. There were a few more texts from family, but one stood out, a message from Amy. Now, this was the last thing I expected. I hadn't spoken to her in 5 years, and suddenly there was a message from her, sitting right there on my screen. I didn't know whether to open it or ignore it. Part of me thought it might just be another guilt trip, or maybe even worse, some kind of demand for money directly from her. But after a minute of staring at the notification, I decided to open it. Her message was short, too short for how long we hadn't spoken. Can we talk? That's all it said. No apology, no explanation, just those 3 words. I didn't know what to make of it. On one hand, I was curious. On the other, I was wary. Why now, after all this time, was she reaching out? Was it because of the wedding? Because I'd refused to pay? Or was it something else entirely? I sat there, staring at the screen, my finger hovering over the keyboard as I tried to figure out what to say. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to avoid whatever new drama this was about to stir up. But another part of me, maybe the part that still cared, even just a little, wanted to hear her out. After a long pause, I typed a reply. Sure. And just like that, the door I thought I'd closed for good creaked open a little bit. So, after I sent that sure text to Amy, I wasn't really sure what was going to happen next. I mean, it had been 5 years, and we hadn't exchanged a single word during all that time. Now, all of a sudden, she wants to talk? It felt off, like there had to be something more behind it. But I didn't know what to expect, and honestly, I wasn't sure if I wanted to. A couple of hours went by, and I started thinking maybe she wasn't actually going to respond. Maybe she just wanted to feel like she made an effort, or maybe she was waiting for me to make the next move. Either way, I was fine with the silence. But of course, just when I'd started to relax and move on with my evening, my phone buzzed again. It was Amy. She'd replied, "Can we meet up? I don't want to do this over text." I stared at the message for a while, not sure how to feel about it. Part of me was curious, sure. I mean, I'd been waiting for some kind of explanation for years. But at the same time, the other part of me was still holding on to all that frustration and anger. I didn't know if I was ready to meet her face to face, especially not with all the wedding stuff still hanging over our heads. But in the end, I figured if I didn't meet her now, I'd never get any real closure on this whole situation. So I sent back a quick reply. All right, when and where? We ended up agreeing to meet at this little coffee shop downtown the next afternoon. Nothing too fancy, just a quiet place where we could talk. As I walked in the next day, I could feel that familiar tension in my chest. I hadn't seen Amy in years, and I had no idea what this conversation was going to look like. She was already sitting at a table when I walked in, staring at her phone. She looked up when I approached, and for a second we just kind of awkwardly stared at each other. She looked different. Not in a bad way, just more grown up, I guess. It was weird seeing her after all this time. "Hey," she said quietly. "Hey," I replied, taking a seat across from her. The tension was thick, like neither of us knew where to start. After a long pause, she sighed. "Look, I know things between us have been bad, and I get why you're mad. I probably deserve it." That caught me off guard. I'd expected her to jump straight into wedding talk, maybe even ask for money directly. But here she was, admitting she'd screwed up. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, letting her continue. "I messed up a lot, I know that, and I'm not asking you to forget everything, but I just wanted to try to fix things, before it's too late." I leaned back in my chair, processing her words. Part of me wanted to be skeptical, to believe she was just saying this because she needed something from me. But another part of me saw how genuine she looked. Like maybe, just maybe, she really wanted to make things right. "I don't know, Amy," I said finally. "A lot's happened. You can't just undo all of that with an apology." She nodded, looking down at her hands. "I know, but I have to try." And for the first time in years, I realized that maybe this wasn't about the wedding. Maybe this was about something more.